part 2, where today we're going to be replacing all of the bushings on the rear of the Mini. In part 1, which I'll link up here somewhere, we replaced all of the bushings on the front of the car. So if you want to see that, go back, watch part 1, and then come back and watch this one. As you can probably tell, the rear of the car is a lot more simple than the front. We only have these 6 bushings to change out. 2 of them have already been done, which we did when we replaced the struts. It is a small little thin bushing that sits on top of the strut in between the top hat and the car. So if you want to see that, go watch my video that I did on putting bill signed struts on this car. But the rest of these should be pretty simple. These 8 are actually identical, so whether you're doing the upper or lower arm in the rear, it's the same bushing on inside and outside. Very easy. All we're going to be doing is like in the first part, where I cut the outer sleeve of the bearing, pressed it out, did a little bit of drilling on the rubber as well, and then just push this one in with my vise is what we're going to be doing for these 8. Same thing for this process. It's just this is a multi-piece bearing, so you've got this aluminum sleeve here, 2-part bearing, and then the inner collar. These are from PowerFlex, so these 2 bushings for the front bushing on the rear trailing arm, and then these are for the other 2 arms in the rear. These are from SuperPro. Again, I would like to thank ECS Tuning for helping with the PowerFlex bushings in the rear, both the ones that are on the car now and the ones that we're going to be installing. So what we'll do is jack up the rear of the car and just start unbolting things. Like before in part 1, just for those of you who are only watching part 2, which shame on you, I will show you how I choose to remove a bushing using a sawzall, some drill bits, and then of course a vise for those of you who don't have a press. And then we'll just lube all these up, put them back in, and of course you will have to realign your car to make sure that your camber and toe alignment is still in spec. So if you're aligning your car yourself, you can kind of do this whenever, but if you are paying someone to align it, obviously do parts 1 and part 2 together so you can get the front and rear suspension all aligned in one go. So here we have one of the lower control arms in the rear. They are identical, the upper and lower. The only difference I can tell is there's these 3 indentions here on the lower arm. On the upper arm, these are drilled out holes. I'm not really sure what the difference is, but shape, length, everything else is identical. You can see over here, here's your bushing. I'm using a 1/8 inch drill bit to drill little holes in the rubber, and then a 1-inch hole saw to drill it out from either side. And it shreds it pretty good. So you can see that metal sleeve here that was over here, it comes out pretty easily. I have had no issue. I've done 2 of the arms so far and it went pretty easy. And then eventually, like on the front, what I'll do is cut a very fine slit on the inside with a sawzall, and then from there, this one I got almost perfect, so I was able to press it out. But I'll usually cut 2 strips right here, fold this out of the way, and then press it out either with my vise or hit it out with a hammer. It just kind of depends. So they've been going along pretty easily. The only issue on these is if you look over here on the end, it splits out like this, and there's nothing connecting these 2. So if you try to press this with a vise or even a regular press, it is going to squeeze it together. So you're going to have to put some piece of metal here in between these 2 pieces to keep these from collapsing. When I'm pressing in the new bushings, number 1, I have them sitting in the freezer right now. They're in ice water, so they are hopefully going to be a little bit smaller than they normally would, so pressing them in should be easier. And then of course, once this old one's pressed out, clean all this inner barrel up with Scotch-Brite, and also make sure that you're using a lot of WD-40 when you're pressing it in, but I'll show you that in just a second on the vise. Alright, so here's one of the arms with the bushing in place. It fits just like the factory bushing, except it's polyurethane, so really not a whole lot to see here. But like I said, keep a piece of metal in between here when you're pressing this in, watch the WD-40, and freezing it definitely helps. I mean, the first one was brutal with none of that, and now they just glide right in. It's pretty easy. I'm also using the aluminum collar from the trailing arm bushing to go around here to give me something to press on, so I have a cup here. And as I'm pressing the vise, it'll give me room to get this to stick out the other side. I've just been centering these as best I can, but it doesn't seem to make too big of a difference. So we will get the other side done, and this will be us done for the passenger side, and then we can move on to the driver. Alright, so we are currently sitting under the passenger taillight. You can see you've got your lower control arm here and your upper control arm up at the top. They are identical. The only difference, like I said, is those holes up there at the top, but they're just dimples on the bottom one. I'm not really sure what the difference is. But if you swap them around, I don't really see any problems coming from that. We already have the passenger side done, so we have our new bushings in. It wasn't too bad. It was just a little tedious getting things in and out because they'd been in for a while. And then, of course, getting everything back in with the polyurethane, it's not quite as flexible. So getting all the bolts to line up was a little annoying, so make sure you keep everything loose. So we're going to go over and do the driver's side. What we're going to do is we're going to start by loosening up the 16mm bolts on the bracket holding the trailing arm bushing, and then we're going to loosen up the 18mm bolt that goes through the bushing. We'll make sure that we mark the 3 16mm bolts because that's how you adjust the toe in the rear here. So we want to make sure we put it back exactly where it came from. We'll still check the toe when we're done, but it should save you a little bit of effort, especially if you get it right the first time. But make sure you break everything loose. I put all of this, put WD-40 on it like 4 or 5 hours ago, let it sit for a long time. Cracked everything loose, made sure they would all break loose first before I got started. Didn't want to get halfway through and find a seized bolt. So I'm just going to go ahead and disconnect everything. The bushing for the trailing arm is connected to that bracket, so you will have to remove the bracket. So I think it's easiest just to get all of it out, and we'll go do all the bushings at the same time and come back and put everything back in at the same time. One thing to definitely note is I think the easiest way to put the bushing for the trailing arm in is to put the bolt through the bushing and bolt the bushing to the trailing arm, and then use the 3 16mm bolts to align everything and get it pulled back up to the chassis. I think that's a lot easier than bolting the bracket on first and then trying to get the bolt through the bushing. It was just way too hard that way. Oh, and one last thing, make sure you loosen up this heat shield. It'll give you a lot more room to work up here. Trying to get to the inside of these trailing arms, you can see it's kind of hidden up here in this boxed area. So it's definitely not the easiest thing to get to. You will need a very specific combination of either a longer socket or a narrower ratchet. I'll show you what I'm talking about in just a second, but it is a very tight space. So here is 3 different combinations of 18mm sockets. I have my 1/2" breaker arm with my 1/2" 18mm socket, my regular ratchet with an 18mm socket here and an 18mm deep socket here, and this is the perfect length to fit in that area that you have to attack the inside mounting point for the upper and lower control arm. This is just long enough to actually seat onto the head of the bolt, but it's not so long that I can't get anything in there. This deep socket is too long, I can't quite get it into the space, and this one is too short, I can't quite hold it onto the head of the bolt. So this is the perfect size, so you're going to have some different size sockets and kind of work with what you've got. Alright, so I went and grabbed a ruler. This setup right here is 6 centimeters long, this is 8 centimeters long, and this is 4 centimeters long. So 6 centimeters seems to be the Goldilocks area, so that's what you're looking for. And just a heads up, everything on the rear suspension is 18mm, so you'll definitely want an 18mm box wrench if you don't have one. But 18mm except for those 3 bolts that are holding up the trailing arm bracket. And just to give you an idea of what you're working with here, we have 2 18mm captured bolts on this other side, so the nut is actually welded to the spindle. On the inside you have 2 18mm nut and bolts. Mine were pretty rusty, especially the head of the bolts, so just be careful with that. I thought they were 19s, but they are 18s. And then we'll move up and do a shot of the trailing arm. Alright, so here we are at the front of the trailing arm, so to give you an idea where we are. Alright, so if we follow the trailing arm up to where it actually attaches, up towards kind of where the driver and passenger sit, you can see we have a bolt here on the outside of the car, one on the inside, and then one towards the front of the car. These are how toe is adjusted, so like I said, make sure you mark these before you start disconnecting things. I think it's easier to undo the bolt going through the bushing and then back out the bracket, and then do opposite on your way back in, so put the bolt through the bushing first and then bolt the bracket up to the car. There are 3 16mm bolts and then a 1 18mm bolt going through the actual bushing. Well, here is the bracket that holds the bushing for the rear trailing arm. So you've got a actually pretty thick aluminum collar here that goes all the way around. So we'll be drilling through this rubber just like before, connecting all the holes, and then we'll press everything out after we cut the collar a little bit. It's pretty simple. Just make sure that, again, you put a piece of metal here in between this opening so that these 2 pieces do not clamp together as you're trying to press everything in. I'll show you where, when you're pressing the collar in, you are eventually going to have to get some sort of spacer on this side as well to give you some room for the collar to come all the way through, but I will show you that in just a second. So we have the 2 driver's side control arms done. So you can see we've got everything evenly spaced. We still have this gap here in the middle because we protected that with a wrench. And now we're just going to do the bushing for the rear trailing arm. So you can see we have this collar here. On one side it is small and it doesn't have a lip, and on the other side it does. You want the lip to go towards the outside of the car. So check the orientation of the carrier. The two closer together 16mm holes, those go towards the inside of the car, this one being in the front, and then this being on the outside of the car, these two being the rear. So you want this on the outside, as well as the bushing that fits this. So there's going to be a smaller and there's going to be a wider side to the two pieces of polyurethane. So you want the smaller side over here on the inside and the larger one on the outside. There's this little lip here. I'm not sure why it's there, but I kind of try to file it down just a little bit. I'm going to clean this up a bit more before I press it in, but as it's going through, it gets caught on this opposite side because, of course, there's a gap here. So it's not the easiest thing to press in. Even if you do have a press, it's still going to get stuck a little bit. So I would recommend giving this just a little bit of a file just to help it slide through a little bit easier. So we're going to go ahead, press that in. Once it's in, we can press in the polyurethane by hand, and then we are done putting bushings on. We can get everything on the car, and we can go for a test drive to see how our complete bushing swap changes the handling of the car. Alright, well, we've got all of the bushings in place, so what we're going to do is go ahead and throw them back in the car. After doing the passenger side, I figured out what I think is the best order to put everything back in. I would say step 1, put the bolt through the trailing arm bushing and tighten that down to the trailing arm, then lift this up into place to put the 16mm bolts in without connecting these at all. The trailing arm should move nice and easy, so you should be able to easily lift it in place without having to use any sort of pry bar or a jack or anything like that. Then once this is in place, install these. I do think it's easier to actually attach the ones to the trailing arm, like at the spindle first, because those have a captive nut. So getting the bolt through and then getting it to line up with the threads is actually pretty difficult. The other side, even though you don't have a whole lot of access to it, it is just a straight shot through. So you can kind of press it through with a pry bar, or maybe if you can get a little bit of a hammer in there, you can do that. But you just have to get it through the hole. And with these beveled edges on here, it's not quite as bad. So you should be able to slip the bolt through pretty easy, and then you can put the nut on the other side. So I'm going to let you know how that goes, but I do think that's going to be the easiest way to get all this to go in and to line up easily, because these polyurethane bushings don't move quite as much, so it is a little bit more difficult to get everything to line up. Well, I wanted to give you guys my opinions on the bushings now that I've had them in the car for a while. I did a full track day at Roebling Road with them, and of course driven around on the street for several hundred miles. And really the biggest thing I noticed, and I noticed this less than 100 yards from my house, is the steering is now amazing. Any sort of slight movement in the steering wheel instantly translates to movement of the wheels on the ground. The steering just feels worlds better. It is the biggest change by far, not even close. Definitely makes it worth it. The only negative is that engine bushing. I deeply regret installing that engine bushing, and it is now gone. So I would not recommend putting that in. This Tritec engine, it vibrates a lot, and it really, at idle, it was just awful. The rest of the time, it was fine, but at idle, it was just so annoying. I couldn't handle it. So other than that, I have no complaints about the bushings. I don't think they add any sort of extra harshness as far as bumps in the road surface feel, anything like that. I don't think there's any negatives there. It was just that engine mount. But the steering feel, like I said, immaculate. I'm sure the car handles better because the suspension components are doing their job with a little bit less flex, but it wasn't something I could tell a difference. I didn't go out at Roebling Road and feel like the car was completely transformed. Really, the only thing that changed was the initial turn-in. After that, I feel like it feels pretty similar, which makes sense because with the rubber bushings, once the car loads up that bushing, after that, it's really not providing any extra flex. So it's just helping our geometry stay better, and it's going to help that more precise turn-in. So as I change, things will change more rapidly. So I am really impressed with them. It is a ton of work. It's not a whole lot of money invested. It's, you know, maybe $400, $500, but the amount of time invested to get all these in and the effort, it is a lot. So it's something that you're really going to have to consider. But because these cars are anywhere from 15 to 20 years old now, they really do need their bushings replaced. So if you're going to replace it, why not replace it with poly instead of just replacing it with stock bushings? Because like I said, it has not negatively affected the ride quality of the car at all. But that'll be a decision you guys will have to make. Of course, if you have any questions about that, feel free to drop those in the comments down below. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you guys next week.